And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 219. Today we're going to be looking at the essential editing checklist. So, more about that to come. Make sure you stick around. If you happen to be watching live, then leave a comment. Let me know you're here. Let me know where you're from. Let me know what the weather's doing. The chat and interaction is always a major part of these podcasts. Makes me feel better that I'm not just talking straight into a blank webcam if I know somebody happens to be listening. If you happen to be watching the recorded session, you can also leave a comment, although I won't, of course, be able to respond to it live. Yes, let's make a start. So yes, welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 219. So what we're going to be talking about today is an essential editing checklist. Essentially, this came from out of a conversation with April, who won the third quarter of the Smug Points Challenge. And she said, we learn a lot, we take our photos and we're, getting all our understanding about different kind of compositional techniques. But what about the kind of polishing it up bit, the finishing it off? And for a lot of us, we're out there, we take photos with our phone and then maybe we just, where do we start with the editing process? Now everybody's got things, that favourites that they fall back on. But that's really, what I'm going to do is, there's all sorts of major advanced techniques, but what's the basics? Where do you need to start? What do you kind of need to look at to go, yes, at least I've done this, or if I haven't done this, I've made a conscious choice not to do it. That's what we're going to be talking about today. I see we've got a couple of comments in already, so let's see who's joined us. Robert says, howdy all from Texas. April says, greetings from a cold Long Island, New York. Nadia's joined us and says, hi all from a cold and dull Fife. Oh, by the way, Nadia, just to let you know, I did get your email. So, yeah, that's fine, thank you. Susan says, hello from a rather grey but mild Kakubri. Scotland's weather is crazy. It has been kind of a bit all over the place lately, it does have to be said. VG says, good evening friends from a stormy Chennai. Cyclone Fengal is across the coast this evening. Wow, okay, I hope everything's fine with you there, VG. Rebecca joins us and says, got my cuppa. Sandra says, hi everyone from a sunny and mild Birmingham. John says, good day everyone, very cold here in Ohio. Marilyn says, hello from a sunny but cold Colorado. Robert Schaefer joins us and says, good morning from a sunny Dallas. For your information, I joined PhotoCrowd last week, if anyone is interested. Excellent. And Meg says, hello everyone. So yes, little just actually with the notion of PhotoCrowd is... just for anybody who hasn't yet submitted, if you happen to be on PhotoCrowd, I set up a Faceless Portraits challenge on PhotoCrowd to follow in and tie in with the fact that we had our Faceless Portraits challenge last week here on the podcast, episode 218, if you want to go and check it out. So I think it still runs for a few days yet. So if you haven't yet submitted, if you either use one of the photos that you put in for our challenge, or if you going on what we talked about, maybe you want to make any subtle adjustments to it before submitting it, or you might well have been inspired to have a go at doing something else as well, seeing what other people did. So there's the chance there to do another Faceless Portrait challenge, but you of course are now all the wiser for having been through the portrait challenge we put in last week and 2 weeks before that, where I talked about the whole notion of Faceless Portrait Challenge and gave you a whole bunch of ideas. You can always go and revisit that. So I think there's still a few days left. I can't remember exactly whether it's Wednesday or Thursday it shuts, but you've got time to submit to that. Also, running on that notion of Faceless Portraits, last week we had the problem with that Sandra sent in a piece, or she thought she had, and I didn't receive it. But we managed to get this sorted out, worked out what had happened after the podcast. But just to show you, just because it was quite a fun one to include, this was Sandra's entry for the Faceless Portraits Challenge last week, and what she'd said was, here's a photo I took earlier in the year at Pride. It is of two leather men dressed in dog masks. They posed themselves as they walked past me in the parade. The camera was set on continuous shooting and the focus point was in the middle of the screen. The shooting was at about 500th of a second to prevent blur. So Sandra basically, she had 500th a second doing a continual shoot and just went for it and managed to catch these. And I think this is really fun. It's a nice interaction with the camera. And of course, we can see the eyes, but masks on, Faceless Portrait, fits the bill, I think. So turned up too late to be included, but I have added Sandra, I've given her the 10 extra smug points that she would have had it managed to come in last week. So thanks for sending that one in, Sandra. What else? Oh yes, well of course, smug points then. So just to let you know that with the accumulated smug points for November, Susan was the winner with 80 accumulated smug points. VG got 75 and Becca got 70. So that was our top three. Because Susan accumulated the most smug points for November, she got to choose a challenge for December. So in fact, actually, there's going to be 2 challenges coming up in December. So I'm going to talk more about that later. So stick around. We've got quite a busy month ahead of us. Lots to do. And also on the accumulation for the year, for the whole year, accumulated smug points. VG is out there in front, about pretty much 85 points ahead of the next nearest rival, which is Robert Gullick from Texas. Third up, just 10 points behind Robert, is April. And then I would say Sandra, Susan, Janet and Nadia are still potentially within shot of this if you contribute and the others fall by the wayside. I mean, there are 2 challenges coming up in this month, and next week will be a feedback session as well. So if you put in an image for feedback, you get a bonus 25 smug points for that. Nadia has already got one in for feedback for next week, so there will be probably about another 3, maybe 4 max places for that. So have a think about any images you might want to get genuine feedback on. There's very few places on the internet where you can get real, genuine feedback on your own photos, and it's one of the best ways of learning. So make the most of the fact that this podcast allows for it. But I will give you a recap at the end of the podcast about what's coming up and what to submit and all the rest of it. No, actually, sorry, the feedback session won't be next week. The feedback session will be in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks' time, on the 15th. Right, so where are we? Sandra says cheers, Kim. Right, so let's make a little start. What are we talking about here? So this idea of an essential editing list. This came out of April, got in contact, and we're talking about the sort of finishing off. I mean, we take the photos, but then there's the notion of editing. Now, there is, you can say, there's controversy right at the beginning before you even start, because there are a certain group of photographers who feel that if you are editing, you are no longer doing photography. That photography is what happens within the camera with the light hitting either the film or the sensor. That's what photography is. Anything that comes after that is mucking about with it, is no longer photography. Now, I have talked about this in the past, but where I come from is the idea that editing is a crucial part of photography. The analogy I would use is if you were doing poetry, would you say that the first draft that fell out of your head onto the paper is the final thing? No, you would say that's your starting point. And then what you do is you edit the poem in order to be able to maximize the impact of the story, the narrative that you are trying to impart to the reader. Now, similarly, with photography, I tend to feel that you're preparing to working out what you're going to photograph, looking around, taking the photograph, looking in the back, seeing if you've got what you want, making adjustments is all part of photography, and then editing the photo to intensify, to distill the narrative is a crucial part of photography. Now, there are then further debates as to how far you can go before it essentially stops being photography. And to a certain extent, there is no definitive line. Everybody's got a slightly different place where you draw that line. And we may well touch on that. And actually, if you have any very strong feelings on this yourself, or interesting points that you've come across in the debate that you would like to put into the comments as we go through this today, then please do. Because this is about editing, and to get other people's input and ideas on what counts as editing, what you're allowed to call editing, if there a point whereby that no longer counts, you've gone too far. I think it's all a rich part of the debate. We are all photographers, we are all playing around with the camera, and it's useful to have an idea of where different people have a sort of stance on this. So feel free to put that in, have a little bit of a debate going if we can. So before we even start on editing, it comes from the point that I keep expressing with the photo, which is, what's the story you're trying to tell? And the story doesn't have to be War and Peace, the story doesn't have to be huge, but at the point something grabs your eye, at the point you bring the camera up or you pull your phone out, there is something about whatever was before you that made you think this was worth taking a photo of. And there's a point whereby that photo is going to be seen by somebody else. What is it you are trying to communicate in your photo? Now, it's possible that photo is only ever going to be seen by you, but perhaps you're taking it for a memory. Perhaps you're taking it as part of like a kind of sketchbook or a kind of mood board for something else you're going to create later. The same principles still apply. If there's a squiggly little line and you really like that squiggly little line, you want to incorporate that squiggly little line into something else later, then understanding how to best capture that squiggly little line so that it's going to be able to remind you of what it is you want to incorporate is just as relevant as if you're going, my goodness, that's an amazing sunset. I want to be able to show my friends what this sunset looked like later. Or look at the shape of the horns on that ram. Isn't that brilliant? Or whatever it is. Or even, I've got this picture and, this topic would fit in perfectly into that competition I saw on PhotoCrowd or ViewBug or Guru Shots or anything like that. Or even a challenge here on, on Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. So your starting point is always, what's the story? What's the narrative? What's the key point you're wishing to express to the viewer of the photo afterwards? That's what should be in your mind at the point you're taking the photo, because once you understand what it is you want to communicate, that affects absolutely everything that comes next. It helps you to decide the angle you're going to photograph it at, the settings you might have on your camera, compositional tricks you might try to include in order to intensify, to distill that narrative and get it across as strongly and clearly as possible. Now, once you have that photo, what is the editing doing? Well, the editing is doing that again. The editing is now to take you to a point where you can say, how can I distill this further? How can I intensify this story further? How can I communicate this narrative, this story, this idea, this mood, this feeling, such that the viewer is going to really feel and get what it is that I'm trying to communicate in the way that I'm trying to communicate it? Okay, so the editing process is going to help you with your narrative communication. Okay, now, as I say, if I was to do a complete idea on what you could do with editing, we'd be here for years. There are so many tutorials on so many different things. However, there are starting points, and this is what we're going to look at today. Your kind of essential starting kit with editing. Where should you start? What should you include? What should you think of? And what should you either be doing or deciding that you're not going to do, but making a conscious decision not to do it. Okay, so that's what today is about. A couple of comments here. Becca said, I'm always amazed at what others can do with editing. I like that analogy with poetry. I also write poetry, so that view makes sense to me. That's good to know. For my own photos, though, I distinguish between straight shots, i.e. unaltered, and the ones that I would edit to tell the story better. Well, if you have a photo which actually does everything you need to do it in camera, and it doesn't need editing, well then that's fine. There's no point in overcooking something if it already does everything that you need it to. That's okay. The point that I wish to get across is the idea that is considering, can I improve the story by editing? And that's really what we're going to be looking at, is where would you start if you want to say, well, where would I go with the editing? How would I start to improve it? So I think what I'm going to start with is the idea of cropping, because cropping is your starting point. It's where before you do anything else, you crop. Or you don't crop. Maybe it's perfectly fine, and that's okay. But it's your first starting. It's the first question you need to ask is, do I need to crop this? Now, the cropping can basically cover 3 different ideas for cropping. There's first of all, which is the idea of straightening the horizon, straightening the verticals, just making sure that it's balanced right. Okay. The second part is the idea of maybe removing unwanted elements. Perhaps you've got something sitting on the side of the photo that is jarring, that is removing attention from the narrative, so you end up wanting to kind of just crop that bit out because it's not relevant to the story you're trying to tell. And the third part is making sure that the subject is in the right place within the image. Are you wanting to do a kind of rule of thirds, so it's just off center, or are you wanting the subject smack bang in the center, or are you wanting the subject sort of which quadrant, which part of the photo do you want to have the object in? Now, in an ideal world, you manage to get that in camera. In an unideal world, which is most of the time, unless you happen to have a still life set up, which you've already got, if you are taking photos on the fly, if you are capturing something when it's moving, or maybe you just didn't, there were other pressures, you were distracted, whatever it is, you didn't get it lined up as you wanted, and by cropping in, you can now kind of place what you want in a better position in the camera. So those are the 3 bits. So let's make a starter. Let's give you an example of what I mean. So let's go here. Let's swing across and say, supposing you then, for whatever reason, you've decided to take a picture of this here, which is a kind of a water stop against the wall. And we can see straight away that quick phone photo, maybe what grabbed your attention was the idea you like the yellow against the brickwork, maybe it's something about the paintwork, something like that, but you decided that some of the examples I'm using here aren't really that award-winning photos. We're just using them for the purpose of understanding the editing. But what immediately strikes us about a picture like this is it's not quite straight. And not quite straight, now there's not to say that you always have to be absolutely straight. Sometimes photos work better at an angle. But you've got to, again, make the conscious decision to say, should it be at an angle? So if I just open this with Photoshop, then as soon as we bring it into here we are into the crop. Now, I'm using Photoshop for this, but most of the things that I'm going to show you today, you can do on your phone or your tablet as well in the basic editing software that comes with pretty much any device these days. If your device takes photos, then you will have some kind of photo editing software on there. And practically every phone or tablet has some kind of editing system. So with this, if I click on here, I get like a grid, and we can see, and I can just rotate that, and I can use the grid lines to make sure that it lines up so that I'm creating a straight horizon. So the top of the wall, the bottom of the wall is straight, and the verticals as well, so that the yellow bar in the middle there is also straight. So now that I do that, that's given us a straightness. At this point also so in terms of, there we go, that's straight, but also this is maybe sitting slightly higher than I want. So I can now drag this up, and maybe I leave a similar gap between the bottom of the yellow part and the edge of the photo as there is between the top of the yellow part and the edge of the photo. And then maybe it's just slightly off center. So if I drag this a little bit over, I can have that in the center. And immediately, just going from that to that has improved the feel of the photo. Okay, there's nothing amazingly complicated about this, but just straightening it out. Okay, or if we wanted, as I mentioned the idea before, if we go back, actually, let's just go back to here. If we wanted to have it in a slightly different place, we could straighten it like that. But supposing I wanted to do more of a kind of rule of thirds, I might decide to take it across and just have my third line there sitting across, something like that. Actually, I think I've maybe tilted it a bit far, maybe need to tilt it back a fraction, something like that. And so maybe I've decided that I want to have my yellow thing off to the left or to the right, depending on what I'm wanting. Maybe if there's another element, particular coloured leaf or a tennis ball or something else, so I've decided that I will want it to the left or right. So, but this cropping, whether I decided to have it in the middle, whether I decided to have it at the edges, or for that matter, whether I decide that I want to have it in a landscape style crop, like not that, like that, or if I wanted to have it portrait, like that, or if I wanted to have it square. So depending on where this is going to be seen, then maybe again I want it in the middle, or I want it off to the left, or I want it off to the right. So cropping then. Our first thing is essentially straighten the horizon. Okay. Now, so I'm going to, can I reload that? Just realising the chat isn't, right, okay, that's fine. Got my tablet down to the side so that hopefully I can read comments as they go, but I suddenly realised some of the comments weren't catching up. So, that's a starting point. And if you're looking for, generally speaking, a straight horizon is what you're looking for. If you want to go for a tilt, you need to go for a definite tilt. Okay? So if we decided we wanted to have this at an angle, like that, then that's okay. We can go for the angle, or that way. But the worst thing is when it's just slightly off. Okay, so if you're going to do an angle which is at least 25, possibly 30 degrees, so that anybody looking at it knows that it's supposed to be tilted. The worst bit is when we're about 2 or 3 degrees out and you're just kind of going, it just looks odd. It just looks like it needs to be straightened. Because at that point, people are thinking it needs to be straightened. They're not. So you're not communicating what you wanted to communicate. Maybe what you're trying to communicate here is you like the colour and texture of the yellow against the kind of terracotta brickwork. And that's not being communicated. What's being communicated is, oh, the horizon's wonky. Okay, so that's the point of making sure that the horizon is straight. But sometimes there's a notion of what do you do if the horizon isn't straight. I mean, fine, we can see the horizon isn't straight here. Or rather you can't get a straight horizon. So if you take a picture like this, so here we're looking up, we've got a building, I'm using my phone, it's got a wide angle on it, so everything's becoming slightly distorted. And actually the power in something like this is more to do with the lines of the diagonals than it is to do with the verticals and horizontals. But this feels tilted. So how do we set about straightening this one? Because if I take it into here, if I straighten it in accordance with, and say I want to give it a flat horizon and layer, so that we go with the roof up like that. Somehow it doesn't quite look right. Now we've lost the interesting diagonal. This step has become straight. This still doesn't quite look right. Maybe I've gone too far, but I'm trying to straighten the horizon, but then we've still got diagonals. It doesn't really feel like it's sort of sitting comfortably. So if we go back here, what we might try and do is, rather than thinking about the horizontal, is to think about the verticals. But then again, which of the verticals are we going to attach it to? So if I again attach it to the side, this side vertical here, the side of the house, you can see the whole thing becomes tilted. So obviously that's not working. So what if I try attaching the vertical to this drain pipe over on the right? Well, again, everything's become distorted. On this side, the whole thing feels tilted. So very often what you're looking for is a strong vertical somewhere, usually around the middle. So if I look where the pictures join and just sort of line that up with that, now I think we've got a much better sense of vertical. So I can crop this how I want to have it. Let me bring that in a little bit so I've not got the white on. And we know that there's a distortion. We know there's a distortion, perspective distortion, because we're looking up and possibly exaggerated by the wide angle on the camera. But because we've anchored to the middle here, that's kind of made it feel okay. The brain goes, oh, well, it's a distortion caused by the camera or the perspective, rather than feeling like, oh, that doesn't look right. Okay, so let me show you another example of this. Is if we take this photo. And so here we have, now this was a particularly tricky one to try and work out, is this balanced or not? And it actually feels to me like it's kind of leaning to the left. So we've got a building site, we've got this, word escapes me, truck, loader, this loader here, and it looks at this like it's going downhill, but we also know that this is going to be built on a flat surface here. So whereabouts are we going to adjust our line here? And I think, again, if we were to take it to the edge of this building and line it up there, what we see is it now looks even more tilted. If we, again, we take it and we line it up to the horizon on the background and the uprights here, now it looks even more tilted, but in the other direction. So what we're really looking for, I think, is to go, well, actually, our kind of key object within this is the loader. So if we take this and we just kind of, I would say, within this, we see, if you look at the door here, there's a line there. And that line is kind of giving us a sense of the vertical, of where we would expect the vertical to be. And so we don't need a lot, but if we just sort of tilt that way a little bit so that we then have the vertical line within the door, then suddenly, I think, everything else works a bit. I can take that over there, take that over there, bring that up a bit. Maybe pull that back a touch, and then maybe I will just, to make it easier, just fill in that little bit of gap there. And I think, again, now we have the distortion caused by perspective and caused by wide angle, but that's okay. Okay, the brain is allowing it to set, because the loader itself here is feeling like this is straight. It's not if I take this line here, it's not like the wheels are level, because that would just make it seem, because we are looking at it at an angle. But the middle part of it is kind of level. And the key bit here is that wasn't what I meant to do, to grab a line here. But the key bit is that the door is aligned on the vertical. And that vertical is the bit that allows us to kind of feel that everything sits comfortably. So when you're doing cropping, horizontals, yes, fine. If you've got a big wide horizon, you want to have a straight horizon. But when the horizon isn't obvious, you want to look for a key vertical, and then everything becomes anchored to the key vertical. Okay, so hoping that that makes a bit of sense. Just close a couple of things there. See, we've got comments. Sandra says, I'm glad you mentioned about the problems with distortion when photographing buildings. It's a problem I run into all the time. And Becca says that that's a handy edit. Excellent. Right, okay. So then there's the other bit, which is about, okay, what shall I do? Let's open this one with Photoshop. And let's go here. So you take something like this tulip. There is no horizon we've got to worry about. What I notice with this is that there's a bright orange patch over on the right here, which is catching the edge of another flower, which is actually drawing attention. The lovely thing about this tulip is the deep purples within it and the raindrops on it. So I don't really want that. So what I will do is I will just move this over a little bit and just crop that bit out. Now when I look at it, what I want to do is, it feels slightly unbalanced, so I'll bring that in a little bit, and then I'll bring this down a little bit, and now I have slightly more of the shape that I want. And I think that then is a much better crop. That, you know, again, we're not having to do anything major, but it kind of just feels a little bit more comfortable. Sorry, one sec. Becca said something. Oh no, Sandra said, do you ever use skew or distort in Photoshop? Well, sometimes I do. Sometimes if something is kind of really not quite sitting comfortably, sometimes I will stretch things or reshape things, kind of almost like a lens correction. It works on some things, it doesn't work on others. But at that point, we're going into more advanced editing techniques. At the moment, I just want to talk about the idea of the crop. Okay, so where were we? Let's go back to here. So, and then I suppose if I'll just do one more, then to talk about the idea of where you want to place something. So if we take an image like this, we've got a dandelion sitting in the picture. And the other part of the crop then is, where do we want it? Now, if we want it on a ruler, if we want it on a line of thirds, we might want to kind of do this. And then just if we want to give it more of a cinematic feel or landscape feel, then we're cropping it like that. But what we might also want to do with something like this, where we've got a flower and we've got an indistinct background, is we might even want to have it at an angle. We might want to have a sort of slightly more diagonally shaped image and just have it kind of turning and sort of moving into the frame. And so where we decide to place this, do we want it right over on the edge? Do we want it this way? Do we want it down the bottom? Do we want it on the top? Something like that is another part of cropping. Now, depending on the software you've got, some will have an auto fill of some kind if you happen to go outside the edge. I'll just put that there. But if you've got if you've taken a wide enough shot, then maybe you've got more room for tilting and straightening. Obviously, the more you want to tilt it, the more original image you are losing. So you kind of have to be careful and aware of that. Right. So just to summarise that bit, then the idea with cropping is that it's allowing you to remove elements you don't want, to straighten horizons or find a key vertical so that you're not having to worry about it, just people kind of feeling like they've got to tilt their head in order to make sense of it. And it allows you to just place the element of what you want in the right place within the picture. So if you're wanting it to the left, to the right, in the middle, up, down, all the rest of it, so that it's communicating in the way that you want to communicate it. If you think about when we've talked before about the idea of, say, something like a person walking or riding a bicycle or movement of some kind, generally speaking, you want to have slightly more room in front of them than behind them because of the way the eye gets drawn to it. So cropping is allowing you to just make sure that the eye is going to where you want it to. That's your first part. Right, okay, next bit I want to talk about then, once you've done your cropping, is about what should we call it? Tonal range, or the notion of highlights and shadows and contrast. Okay, so the tonal range, the idea between the brightest part of the picture and the darkest part of the picture, and how that affects what we can see and where our eye gets drawn to. So let's start then with something like this. Okay, so we have our have a picture of a blackbird sitting on the fence, and the light was hitting a brick wall far away in the distance, and that's what's kind of creating that colour background. And there's a bit of a tree there as well, and there's a little bit of a tree slightly closer up hanging down. But we've got a blackbird on the fence. At this point, though, the blackbird is almost silhouetted. Now, if we move right in, we can see that there is an eye, there is a beak. We can see bits of detail on the claw. But it's this bit here which is about where the detail is potentially getting lost. The second part, the second thing to be thinking about with the editing is there detail being lost either in the highlights or in the shadows, and what can I do about it? How can I kind of create a broader range of the tones. Now, let's open this one in Photoshop. Now, you've got options here. If you have, depending on the sophisticated level you've got. Now, if I go to a levels here and I drag that up enough, eventually we get to the point whereby you can start to see more detail within the bird. However, we have blown out the background. If I take the mid-range, I can pull that up. I can get more detail, still keep some of the background, but I've still lost quite a bit of it. Now, depending on the degree of the picture you've got, what you could do is, if we go back to here, and you can select the subjects. Now, again, some phones are now getting more sophisticated with their editing. They allow you to select the subject. And now with a selected subject, what I can do is I could go to the levels. And what we can see here, if you look at the histogram over on the left, because this is black, everything's sort of sitting over on the right. And what that allows me to do is take this middle and drag it up. And I can drag this up and we now have more detail without affecting the background. Okay? Maybe if I want, I can even bring that up, although now we've kind of got a bit pale, but we can kind of jiggle around with these two to get to a point whereby we now have more detail in the blackbird. And if I wanted, I could duplicate that and then invert the mask, Control or Command I, and then do exactly the opposite with this and take it down the way and actually make it darker. So if I wanted to have the background darker and the foreground lighter, you could do something like that. But it's fluffy around the edges. It's a kind of a rough edit. Easier if you've got slightly more sophisticated editing software, that if I go to filter, in this case I'll go to Camera Raw Filter, and what this allows me to do, if I go to the light bit here, I can bring up the shadows like that, and now we've got, and then maybe I can even take the highlights down a little bit, something like that. And so what this has allowed us to do, I could even take the exposure down a little bit, or take the no, I don't want to take the blacks down too far because then I'm going to lose. But I can then play around, and I might play around with clarity, texture, other things. But we've now got a much more visible set of feathers. We've managed to claw detail back out of the shadows. And so instead of it being a sort of semi-silhouetted bird, we've now got a much broader tonal range. And when I go here like this, if we look at the levels, we can see quite a nice kind of spread here, even on the the bird itself. Where are we? Not that one. That one. It's. I need to put that back to a 1 for the moment. We can see that, you know, it's not as pinched up into the left. There's little bits going on there. So that ability then to start thinking about your highlights and your shadows, and can you bring more detail back out of them? Okay. Okay, another option here is, let me just, well, I mean, we can even do, actually, if we go back to this here, another thing we can do is I might want to darken the background or lighten the foreground here, in which case I could maybe take, if I wanted to darken this down around the edges, and then I can mask it, use a mask, and just bring in, lighten back up that part of it. And then if I go to my levels, and this is another bit with when you're checking, always check your levels first of all, see where the histogram is. And what we can see is there's a big chunk to the left here where there's nothing happening. So if I drag this up, this allows me to have a brighter image. Be careful of where there are places which might get highlights blown. So for example, this little, these little, couple of little places in the raindrops where it's just gone a little bit too bright. But with that in mind, we can now have a brighter image. I could even take these curves a little bit darker there. And now, if I just by using those two, you can see the difference between this and this. Okay, so what we're loving about this photo is the contrast between the purples and the greens. And by just playing around with the tonal levels of the light and dark, we're really intensifying that notion of the purples and greens. Okay? So this is why you're then playing around with your tonal levels. Now, at the other end, and again, amazing how much detail you can bring out, is, let me show you this image. This image I took with fellow photographer Alan Wright. I'd had the camera on an entirely different set of settings while I was looking down at some shadows. I pulled up, took a photo of him, forgot to change the settings. He's walking into the sunlight, sun's behind him, completely whiting out almost. And you think, well, there's virtually nothing I can get out of this. And yet, because I had the raw file, because this was taken in RAW, if I bring up the RAW file like this, this is what it looked like in RAW. And in RAW, this is why you ideally want to shoot in it if you can. If you're using your phone, don't worry about it. But the extra levels you can get, if I go to the light here, if I click auto, first of all, look how much more there is there. So what I can do, I take the highlights, pull them down, take the exposure, drag it down. And as I drag it down, bring the shadows, bring the blacks down, we find that there is more detail down here. Let's just actually bring those highlights back up again because I don't want the sky to go grey. But now we're starting to make out he's got a tripod on his back. There's a little white patch here where it's essentially a light flare on the lens. You can see another bit over here. But we've got a lot more into the rock and we can tell the tripod, and we can now make out detail where his shirt is finishing, where he's got a watch on his wrist. So there's a lot more detail to play with at this point. So if I just, but what I could also do with this is maybe, because it's all gone yellow, is maybe go black and white. And if I go black and white, this is now maybe making it a slightly more interesting. And what I could do is perhaps if I take the contrast, take the exposure down, but then bring the contrast up, and we just kind of play around with these little bits. Perhaps I go to the effects, perhaps I go for the clarity tool. Now that makes it look really quite interesting. And now at this point, you see we've got quite a lot of detail. Now, I've got a completely whited out sky, but because I'm doing this in black and white, maybe that doesn't matter so much. Okay? And now when I go to open, I can now decide that maybe I'll pull that down a little bit, pull this over here a little bit. And so I've got him just sort of slightly off to one side. If I wanted to, I might decide to just get rid of that particularly bright white spot just there. Another one there. And a little kind of blown highlight bit there, something like that. And we've got quite an atmospheric photo there. If I decide to get the levels, we find that everything is still, there's more room. If I wanted, I could drag that up, and I could drag this down to here, and he's now even more so. In fact, actually, if I take it down to here, we've now got silhouette. And silhouette becomes an interesting one because silhouette is kind of doing the opposite of broadening the tonal range. At this point, we're narrowing the tonal range. We're just going for as bright and as dark as we can get. So your tonal range sometimes isn't always about creating maximum tonal range. It's sometimes about creating minimal tonal range. But the point is that it's one of these things to take into consideration. What's happening at the highlight end? What's happening at the shadow end? Where should I be making sure that I've not either lost detail or I want to lose the detail? In a case of silhouette, you're wanting to lose detail because the silhouette is all about the outline. Okay. And then the final thing about, I would just say, when you're coming to that notion of playing around with lights, with the tones, the light and shadow, is the notion of a vignette. And a vignette is where you can lighten or darken the outside. And practically, again, every software has a vignette option. And if we take something like this, let's just copy all that onto a new layer. If I go to filter, camera raw filter, and then in my optics here, I can add a little bit of a vignette. And just by darkening in those corners, you don't necessarily want to make it too obvious, but you just pull them in a bit. Then what it does is it draws more attention to what's going on in the middle of the frame. So again, if I do something like this, and I was to repeat that, you see, so it draws even more attention into the subject. If the subject happens to be around the middle, again, I can go here, I can create a little bit more vignette. Now, what I can also do with something like this, again, if I want to go tonal range, let's go up to camera raw filter. With something like this, I can bring down the highlights and get more out of the sky. I can bring the shadows up a little bit, take everything into the mid-range, but then go for the curves, the clarity tool, and then kind of really create more detailed, kind of a grungy crunch kind of stuff. So to go from that to this. And so this notion of where what we're talking about is a muddy, wet building site, that actually by the editing process, bringing out more detail in the sky, bringing out more texture in the mud and on the loader, we've managed to emphasize the narrative that we're trying to get across, which is to come back to the whole point of what it is we're trying to do with the editing. Okay, so I hope that makes sense then as an option or as a concept. Comments, what do we have? VG says lovely edit. April says that's a great edit feature, what you did with the bird. Becca says that makes such a difference. VG says, oh, to be able to see the beak and the eyes from silhouette to details. And Becca says clever. So what we've been talking about then is that notion of highlights, shadows, contrast. So your tonal range. What are you doing with your tonal range? I mean, one of the things I know some periodically crops up with Robert Gulick, we've talked a few times when looking at editing your photos is, and I think sometimes it depends on how a screen can be calibrated as well. Sometimes when you're working on a screen, the screen can sort of make it a picture appear much brighter than it actually is. So it's always worth just putting your levels, doing a levels layer if you can, just to see what it says. Is your histogram nicely spread? So that you've got a full range of tones, or is there a big gap on one side or the other? And if you just drag that slider to the left or to the right, does it actually give you a fuller sense of the picture to make the most of those tonal ranges? So generally speaking, that's what you're going for, unless you've got a reason not to. So like if you are going for that strong silhouette, that's maybe a reason not to. Or if you are going for a particular kind of vintage effect, maybe you don't as well. So it's fine not to do any of these things, but it's about consciously knowing why you're not doing it, rather than not doing it because you forgot to do it or because you didn't understand that there was an option to do it. VG says, I love the sky and the detail in the building and the construction site. Yeah, and if I was spending a bit more time at that construction site, I would maybe separate out the sky and then do one kind of edit with that, and then separate out the truck and do another set of editing within that as well. So you can go in and you can get really quite complicated with the editing, but at the moment what I'm just talking about is the idea of basic starting points with your edits. Now another thing I won't take too much time on, but is to understand the notion of sharpness as well, that you want to make sure that in a photo, generally speaking, the eye gets drawn to where the sharp part is. And well, there could be other things dragging attention away from it, but you want the thing that you are trying to draw attention to be in focus. And sometimes it may be in focus, but just a little boost to the sharpness. So, for example, if we go back here, not so much of a problem in this one, but if we go to, now, if we take a picture like this, so we've got our tulip, I'll put that on a separate layer now. And because it's a shallow depth of focus, we are actually playing with the notion of blur and softness around it. But that also gives us a little bit of room to maybe increase a little bit of sharpness on the surface. So if I go to Camera Raw Filter, I go to Detail and I boost the Sharpen. Now, kind of got to be careful, because if we look at the detail here, it can over sharpen very easily. In fact, sometimes the sharpness isn't so much that as maybe what we want to do if we go to Effects and I just boost the texture a little bit. Texture, clarity, something like that. Now, I don't necessarily want it on the whole picture. So what I will do is I will create a mask. In fact, I'll create an inverted mask so that we've got the softness, and then I will just paint in, we'll make that sure that's white, and just paint in a little bit of boost sharpness to some of these raindrops and just the front tip of this tulip. Okay, so I don't know whether you can tell from that, if I just zoom in a bit more, from that to that, and it just lifts it that little bit. Now, if it's just on a phone level photo, if somebody being viewed, nobody's really overly going to notice it. But if this was being printed, it would make quite a bit of difference just to have, especially things like the reflected trees in that drop there, to be slightly sharper, helps to really kind of lift the photo. So that notion of sharpness is another part of your editing process. Is the right thing you should play, but most of your sharpness is actually to be taken at the point you're taking the photo. Okay. So, quick little point at this point now, which is, if you happen to be finding these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is one of the ways you can do it. And of course, invite your friends along as well. Right. Okay, so, where are we at? Okay, so now the couple of more things I want to talk about is the notion of, well, this color balance, okay? And getting the right color balance. Now, sometimes your white balance in a picture can be sort of slightly distorted for whatever reason, whether it's a setting you had left on the camera, or the camera's just trying to pull too much in the wrong direction. So if let's take this photo, for example. Not that one. Sorry, let me drag that over there so I can see what's going on. Right, okay, this one. So this photo here of a forest in the mist, okay? And it's green, and it's very green, and maybe it's just sort of slightly too green for my taste. The camera's just kind of sort of created a washout. Now, a very useful thing to do is to very often just hit auto with your color. So if I go to image and I go auto color, you can see it's taken some of that green out. But then perhaps it's, in this case, it's made it darker. It's sort of desaturated a bit, but actually maybe I've lost a little bit too much color. So what else can we do? Sometimes what we could do is perhaps okay, let me duplicate that layer. Oh, right, okay. Do you remember that thing we were doing before with the color, where if I go to channel mixer, and on the red channel, I take the greens up to 100 and I take the blues down to -100, then we end up with very much this sort of much more autumn yellow scene, which is quite interesting. But maybe it's just a bit too yellow. So what I could do is pull that back a little bit, and now we've kind of got something potentially a little bit more interesting. Another option here is, again, if I go into Camera Raw Filter, is if I go to Color and White Balance, I've got options here where I can make it yellower, I can make it bluer, I can make it greener, I can make it more purple. So there's different places I can kind of play around with it. Maybe I make it sort of slightly yellower like that. And then maybe I do the auto color again, see what it does with that. But maybe that's not quite how I want it. I actually quite liked what I was doing over here. So the point is that there's places and ways you can play around with your color balance, which can dramatically affect the mood of your image. So to go from quite a green image to more kind of browns or tonal kind of feel has quite a lot of really changes the sort of mood and sense of it. So your color balance is one of those things. So another thing, looking for your white balance and where that might shift is a kind of an important part of the picture. Now, all right, that's now another thing that can happen with your color is sometimes the color can you can end up with a color distraction from something. So what I'll do is, okay, tell you what, let's shift back here. If we take a look at this, so I saw this lovely army truck just sort of parked in Castle Douglas. So and so again, let's do a kind of a little sort of slight crop here. Is it a slight angle? Maybe I just kind of anchor this to this pole over here, bring this in closer, bring this up a little bit like this, and actually I'll bring this in a little bit more because I want to have slightly, even though it's not moving, I want to have fractionally more in front than I do behind. Just so we've now got this truck here. Okay, in fact, I'll just pull that bit up a little bit more there. And it's quite an interesting army truck. But the first thing that, it's a dull day, and the first thing that happens is that I notice is this red car parked in the background. This red car is now grabbing the attention. So part of the thing to remember about colour is that particular colours will grab the attention more than others. And red, as we've talked about many times before, is one of those that just really screams out at you. So instead of looking at the truck, our eye gets first of all drawn to this red patch over here. So what we can do here is, in this case, if I go to my hue saturation level and then I select reds and I just desaturate that red, if I turn, so we'll turn that red car grey. Quite simply, as simple as that. And now it's not grabbing the attention in anything like the same kind of way. Now, what I've also done is, by doing that, there are a couple of little red hooks on the front of this truck. There's also the little indicator lights and what have you seem to have disappeared, which I quite like back in. So because I've got the ability to do it on here, you can selectively, I can demask those. So if I, sorry, where are we? Take that back up to 100%, and I can just take the mask off those. And I've got to be careful about doing it over here because I bring the red back in. So I will just take that down a little bit, so I do that without getting the red. And maybe I want to have these little hooks back in because they add to the sense of the truck, but without detracting completely. Also, I've lost a little bit of the brown colouring in the tarpaulin over the top there as well. So bringing those back in allows me to kind of have this. So what we can also do with this truck then is let's apply some of the other things that we've been talking about. So we've done the crop, I've straightened it fractionally, I've placed it into the picture, part of the picture that I wanted it. Now what I want to do, if I go to if I put a levels thing there, we've got a range full to the top and bottom, but the middle bit's not very high. It's quite a kind of a dull monotone because it's a dull day. So let's go into Camera Raw here. Let's say I want to, let's also do a little bit of vignette. If I do a little bit of vignette, just to kind of pull attention into the middle. Now what I want to do is maybe brighten it a fraction, but I'm going to pull the highlights down. Well, no, sorry, that's the shadows. I'm going to pull the highlights down a little bit, again, to bring a bit more out of the sky. And I'm going to boost the shadows up to get a little bit more in here. But then what I'm going to do is, again, because we tend to think of an army truck and sort of slightly more grungy and gritty, I'm going to take the clarity tool and really kind of drag that over a little bit. A bit like I did with the building site. Okay, now having taken that over, it also does tend to make the blacks blacker, so I'll go back into here and bring the shadows up just a little fraction more, maybe add a touch more on the vignette, draw that in. Might even play a little contrast, just a little contrast, something like that. And now you can see there's a considerable difference between that and that. So this was the truck, and it was the truck that was the interesting part, but the truck is kind of lost compared to the surrounds. By doing the editing, now our attention gets drawn much more to the truck itself. So this is what you can do with the editing. You know, that the edit. Now, to go back to that notion of how much are you changing it, we've done quite a lot of, but we still fundamentally have what we have. It is a truck, but by changing that car from red to grey, have we crossed the line? Have we, for some people, there's one thing to say, okay, we're going to lighten it a bit, we're going to crop it in a little bit, we're going to just adjust the shadows and tones a little bit. But once you start changing the colour, once you start removing or adding bits, are you crossing a line? Now, again, for me, what I'm wanting to put across, the story I'm trying to put across, is the idea of the truck. I'm not bothered about the red car. The red car is only detracting for me from the story, so I don't mind removing that red. However, if this was a documentary, photo, if I was then putting up, hey, this is what Castle Douglas looked exactly like on this day, then making these adjustments is, you know, well, what happened to the red car? There was a red car there. Maybe that red car becomes important because that red car featured in a crime that happened later on. But I'm not saying that I'm a documentary photographer. What I'm saying is I'm a storyteller. I'm a narrative photographer. What's interesting me is the way this truck is sitting on a cold, damp day in the back of Castle Douglas. And that's what caught my attention. And I'm editing it to enhance that narrative. Now, I understand that some people will have different levels of what they consider to be acceptable and what they don't. I mean, what you can also do with something like this is you can say, well, okay, I quite like that little puddle over there. I wish there was more puddle, because actually if you add a little bit of puddle and reflection. And so what I could do if I wanted, I could make I can select an area here and I can use generative fill. And what I could do is put reflection in puddle into that, and I can click generate. And let's see what it actually comes up with. And at this point, I'm now going to add something to the picture which wasn't there at all. And there we go, we've got a puddle. Reflection, quite nice, that one. That one looks maybe even better. Oh, I quite like that. That's interesting, I like that. That's now got even the edge of the puddle, a bit like it looks like there's a bit of broken road. Makes it, and it's quite astonishing really, and there's ripples in it as well, as there's this very slight breeze as well. I think it's quite astounding, actually, just what that generative fill has managed to do. Does it enhance the picture? Actually, for me, I think that does enhance the picture. I hesitate maybe slightly more to use. I would maybe think twice about where I would use a picture that I had then done that amount of adjustment to, whereby I'm definitely putting in a whole chunk of picture that wasn't there before. It becomes a sort of, I think for certain competitions I definitely wouldn't. For some it's maybe okay. There are some competitions where you go to where actually you have to stipulate if you have used any kind of AI manipulation or whatever in the photo. And in this case, yes, I have. So I could enter this, but I would have to tick the box that said, yes, AI had been added into the photo. Alternatively, although it enhances the photo, for some areas I might feel, well, it does feel maybe just a little bit too much like cheating, that I've actually added in something completely that wasn't there to begin with. So it's an interesting concept. There's a whole kind of area or even minefield of sort of ethical dilemma, if you like, or where you draw the line. And everybody's got a slightly different place of where you draw the line. So again, if you've got a particularly strong thought on this, or you've heard something interesting, add it to the comments. I'd be interested to know. What have we got? Oh, April was saying beautiful woods shot. Sandra saying, I think shifting the colour is something I could play with a bit more. Becca says, me too. VG says dramatic effect. April says that is cool with the reflection. It does look natural. VG also says it looks pretty natural. Meg saying it's a very interesting podcast. Thank you, Meg. Glad you're enjoying it. And VG says the whole blank area now got filled up and it looks more interesting. And that's part of it. So if you are using photography as an art form, as a way of, you have a space here. What you are trying to do is fill that space and create that space, and you're using composition, line, light, form, texture, leading lines, all these kind of things to create an overall effect. Then we are painting with light, but we're also painting with the computer as well, adding bits, taking bits away. So that's kind of giving you a sense, hopefully, of, now the thing is as well, is actually more and more of these are having these built in, where you've the latest Samsung, the latest Google, they actually, part of their selling point is you've taken a photo, but supposing you've got somebody who photobombed in the background, you just literally rub your finger over it, click the delete, and it removes that person for you. And that's so that you could now have a photo of you and your friends, or maybe you fell out with one of your friends and you no longer want them in the group, and you just rub your finger over them, hit the button, and it erases them from the picture. It's about this idea of actually having the image that we want rather than necessarily the one we were able to get. So there is, like I said, it's a kind of a big debate area with this. So that kind of pretty much pulls us to where I wanted to be with this. So in essence then, what to kind of summarize, we're talking about when you're coming to edit the photo, what's it about? Where are you going to start? The key thing, as always, starts with what's your narrative? What's your story? What is it you are trying to convey to the viewer? What's the key aspect? Is it about this object? Is it about this object and how it relates to that object or that background? Is it about this color clash? Is it about the way the light falls? Is it about these lines? Is it about these forms? What is it at the point you brought the camera up to your eyes to take the photo that grabbed you about that scene, that made you think, I want to capture that with the idea that I might want to show somebody else this image later on? Now that's right at the start of what you do with photography to begin with. Then when we come to editing it, how can we then enhance that story? And we enhance that story through the editing. Multiple levels of editing that you can do, but our starting point is the crop. The crop allows us to know, to just get it straight in case it was sort of slightly wiggly, to work out how to make sure that nobody's looking at the wobble or trying to tilt their head. It's also about maybe potentially cropping out unwanted elements. It's then also about the idea of placing the key subject into the part of the photo that we want to have it. Do we want to have it in the center, left of center, right of center, up, down? Where's it going to be most effective to communicate the tale, the story, the mood, the feel that we're trying to communicate? So that's your starting point, is the crop. Your second part then is the notion of your tonal range, your light, your darks, your contrast between the lights and the darks. And generally speaking, you're looking to maximize your tonal range. You're looking to make sure that you've got the maximum amount from, so your histogram will be beautifully spread across and you won't have a big gap at either end. If you've got a big gap at either end, use your levels thing and drag the corners in, and you'll generally find that you've got a better range going on. But at the same time, we're looking at the idea of, if there's detail lost in the shadows, can we pull any of that out? If there's details lost in the highlights, can we pull any of that out? Part of that will depend on the sophistication of your camera, the amount of light or otherwise that was available to you at the time, and just, you know, there's all sorts of limitations which are going to depend completely on the individual photo. But you can explore it. If you think you've got a photo that is maybe worth dragging detail out of the highlights or the shadows, then play with that, because that's your next thing. Or if you're wanting to go in the opposite end of the tonal range, minimize your tonal range, tends to be where you are doing blocks of color, or blocks of tone rather, more likely to be in a silhouette style composition. What's the comment I've got here? John says, my camera club made a rule that says all elements of the photo must be your own work. Yep, that can make it a kind of a clearer line if you want. Certainly that you're not dragging something from somebody else. Well, it depends. You could maybe be making a composition as long as you took the photos of the different bits which you're making the composition out of. So that could be allowed. But that idea that maybe you've used the computer to make it for you is perhaps not allowed, or certainly what wouldn't be allowed would be to take somebody else's photo and slot it in. Susan says, I use a 2020 version of Photoshop, so no AI. Do I want it? Probably not, but occasionally I think it would be very useful. Sometimes where it comes in its maximum use is just extending the corners of the photo out a little bit. And at that point, you don't really feel it's cheating in the same kind of level. You're not trying to add something that really wasn't there. You're just trying to fill in something that you missed, whatever, So you've got a swan on the lake and you're fairly close in, but maybe the swans, you wanted more room in front of it. So you just extend the lake out a little bit. Again, though, how much is cheating? How much is using? Are you allowed to? Are you not allowed to? It comes down to a personal decision, or is the decision of, like John is saying with his camera club, if the rules of the competition are laid out clearly, then you have to stick by them, abide by them. Because if you win by cheating, how good does that feel? Yeah, honestly, to be honest, the imposter syndrome most of us tend to suffer from anyway just gets absolutely magnified beyond belief if we happen to win by doing something that was cheating. So now we get the praise, but we don't feel like we deserved it, and it just amplifies that sense of imposter syndrome. I've never found, I don't think it works at all. Vijay says it's fun to play with technology. There were times when we were developing films, then DSLR, later Photoshop. Learning is fun, but applying is optional. And I think that's absolutely true as well. There's that notion of this technology is developing all the time. And what is it about? If you are telling a story with your imagery, then is it okay to use whatever you can to help you tell that story? And increasingly, I find myself moving in that direction. But again, so much depends on context and where it's being placed. And you're constantly making decisions and balancing that up at the time. Okay. Come back then. So we've talked about the idea of cropping. We've talked about the idea of highlights and shadows. Sharpness, always make sure that the relevant part of the photo is sharp or clear. Sometimes dragging the sharpness slider doesn't always work, but sometimes a little bit of added texture or clarity on the slider can help boost the subject, especially if you just mask the picture off and just allow it to happen in the space where you want it to. And I suppose really, ultimately, it's a slightly more sophisticated level of editing, which is to be able to selectively edit different parts of the picture. But at a basic level, you want to make sure that the sharpness is in the right place. Then we move on to the notion of your white balance, your colour scheme now. Is the white balance, is it a bit too blue? Is it a bit too yellow, purple, green? Can you shift your white balance? Can you play with that? And again, most editing software, even your basic software in your phone, will have some kind of white balance adjustment that you can make. Always worth taking a look at that. And then finally, there's that notion of removing objects that are distracting. So, is that telegraph pole in the wrong place and just drawing your eye? Or is that patch of red on that car or that person's shoes or boots or something as they're walking past distracting? So we're now removing elements to make sure that the key, we're removing elements to make sure that the key narrative is not being diluted or being distracted from. Right, okay, so hopefully then that's giving you a reasonably good sense of basic editing, your editing essentials. And like I say, with all of these, you can choose not to do them, and that's fine. You don't there's plenty of pictures I've got where I've not had to crop. I've got the crop right, or maybe don't need to make adjustments. The point is that these are your starting points to question, do I need to? If I'm going to improve my photo, where do I start? Do I need to look at any of these areas? Maybe I go, fine, no, I don't, and that's great. That's not a problem. Nobody says you have to do the edits if you don't want them to, or if it's going to ruin the image by over-editing it. There's no point in editing where you don't need to. But I think the notion of, is the horizon straight? Is there a key vertical I need to angle that to? Am I using the full tonal range? Is there detail I could be bringing out of the shadows or the highlights? Would a vignette help draw the attention to where I want it to be drawn to? Is the white balance quite right? Does it look just a bit too yellow and insipid? Does it look a bit too blue and missing the warmth that I was trying to get into it? Get your colour balance right. Is there a aspect of the photo where the colour is just dragging my attention away from where I want it to? Can I soften or mute that colour? And ultimately then, these are your starting points. And if you take these into consideration, very basic minimal levels of editing can dramatically make a difference to your photo. So, you know, just to kind of flip back to this, the difference then between, in fact, actually, if I just put all, not that, if I do that, put them into a group, difference from, sorry, here. So we go to the truck, the difference from the original photo, we makes quite a difference, whether or not you want the puddle. If we gain just this, just the color change, makes a difference. If we go to the picture of Alan, well, you remember it was just a kind of an outblown highlight. The blackbird, again, if I just remove that, if I go from that to that. And no, these here are not big sophisticated edits from that to that, but they are all making a difference. So again, if I take that to there, group that, and from that to that, that's after the crop, obviously. In fact, actually, if that's, well, let's go back a little bit further and go, that was the original, and then that is the final image. That to that. And that was just about cropping. So, that point then, that hopefully the editing is supposed to distill, is supposed to enhance the image. What I talk about sometimes is the notion of overcooking, and that overcooking tends to mean you've edited it too far, because when you've edited it too far, you're looking at the photo and you end up noticing the edits before you notice the picture, the rest of the picture, and that's a failure of communication. You're trying to communicate the story. Look at these beautiful colours, look at this strong line, look at this event, look at this subject, look at this relationship between these two parts of the picture. That's what you're trying to communicate. Whereas if somebody's looking at it going, I can just see the edits, they're no longer looking at the photo in the way you want it to. So you have to always be careful with your editing about what point does your editing cross over a line whereby it starts to look edited rather than enhance the narrative. A couple of comments here. What do we say? Okay, April was saying to John, can you at least crop and do the basic edits? John says, yes, editing is allowed, but no AI, I think. He's put IR, but I think he meant AI. Becca says, this was my whole module in History of Photography course at the notion of photography as truth. That's an interesting one as well, it's a whole debate there. I've said in the past, photography, the biggest lie of photography is that the camera never lies. It's absolute nonsense. The camera isn't capable of telling the truth as we perceive it. We perceive the world, we interact with the world in 3 dimensions, spatially, and 4th dimension, temporally. We move through time. So to have a frozen moment from one angle, from a specific point in time, is never going to be truth as we experience it. But it can be a story. It can tell a tale. It can still communicate something back and forth. And very often, a good story can actually often give far more information than, or better communication than the facts alone. So this is part of what I do as a photographer, is I consider myself to be a storyteller with photography. What have we got? Okay, Robert says, I've always looked at the editing process as bringing out more of what's already in the image. John agrees. Sandra says, sometimes you need to Photoshop to get rid of a camera distortion, particularly if you're using a wide-angle lens. Susan agrees with Robert. VG says, the photography gets enhanced with the post-processing. It adds the magic. Overdoing it is strictly a no. Okay, cool. Right, so that brings us to the end of this this section then on editing. To let you know what's coming up, okay, so we've now got a busy December ahead of us. This is your last chance to get Smug Points awarded, to see if you can catch up with VG and Pippa at the post to get what will be a mentoring session. So whoever's won the most accumulated Smug Points, I will do a mentoring session with. Now, if you live locally enough, then I will happily do it with you here in and around Castle Douglas, Dumfries and Galloway. Or if you live and if you want to come to the area, we can do that. Or we can work out via Zoom or some kind of video equivalent. So that's what we're chasing. So we've got two contests coming up. There are two challenges. So next week I'm going to be talking about the two challenges because Susan won the November Smug Points and she put forward the idea of after dark. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about nighttime shooting. But I think particularly because of this time of year, there's a lot of colour. There's, almost, if you happen to be celebrating Christmas or you happen to be a place where people celebrate Christmas, streets are full of lights. Christmas trees are going up, shop windows are full of bits and pieces. So there's lots of opportunities for nighttime shooting. But what do you need to take into consideration when nighttime shooting, given the fact that generally speaking you're not getting as much light into the camera, so you could end up with camera blur just from slow shutter speed. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about shooting after dark. But I also wanted to put in a seasonal food photo challenge as well, and we're going to be doing. So you're going to be sitting down to any kind of seasonal food, so whether it's for Hanukkah or for Christmas or any other celebration, then the chance of taking some quick snapshots of your food, your dinner plate or whatever, what can you do to have a bit of fun with that? So this month then, next week I'm going to talk about those two challenges, about after dark and about seasonal food. The week after, on the 15th, I'm going to have a feedback session. So this is your chance to get genuine feedback on your particular image. What's your sticking points? What would you like to know how to fix or enhance or work out what went wrong with, or how to make much better any particular photo that you have? Perhaps it's one that you're planning on putting into a competition into the new year that you would like to get feedback on now. On the 22nd of December, we will then have the After Dark Challenge. So that's when you will be able to stick in your photos and we'll have the fun, usual kind of fun challenges. And then on the 29th of December, so between Christmas and New Year, we'll have the Seasonal Food Challenge. And that will give you a chance to take a shot of your Christmas dinner if you want. If you've got a Brussels sprout with a particularly nice shine on it, sitting next to a parsnip in such a way that makes you go, wow, I have to take a photo of that, then there's your chance to do it. And then finally, at the beginning of January, the first podcast of January, which will be on January the 5th, we will have the best of 2024, okay? We've been doing this now for the last few years since the start of the podcast. Generally speaking, the first one of January, we have a best of. And so that will be a chance to submit your best or favourite photo of the previous 12 months. And that will be a great kind of... However, that one won't be included into this year's Smug Points. However, whoever wins or whatever for that will be included into next year's Smug Points. So hopefully then that gives you all a whole bunch of fun things to be thinking about. So make sure you turn up next week then, and I'll be talking about a couple of challenges. Last comments, basically people saying cheerio and have a great week and all the rest of it. So that's what I'm at. So don't forget to click a like on the video, subscribe, do all the usual things, share it with your friends. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.